So I'm interested in what you all are coming to this evening with. Do you have any particular thoughts maybe about what has come out of this class? Anything in terms of helpful bits perhaps that some of our discussions have evoked, or helpful elements that have been had a light shined on them, I should say. Is there anything about this conversation maybe that surprised you? Any thoughts that you might have about what this class has brought forward? Please go ahead, Ken. Yes.
Yeah, you challenged us last week with the question, what's the point? and so I've been thinking about that. The Christ of faith, it seems to me, has 30,000 different variations around the world and is therefore very exclusive and focuses on the transaction of accepting a set of beliefs and saying the right things. And for me, the Jesus of history is inclusive and focuses on transformation and verbs. Come follow me, forgive, love one another, welcome a stranger, clothing, feeding, healing. And so that was my aha this week, as I tried to answer the question, what's the point?
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm glad that you took that away from my little rant last week.
I think I just wanted to share that after the first couple of videos that I saw, I had a traumatic dream and relived some religious trauma. I grew up as a minister's kid and was born at a seminary and went to seminary myself and had my faith sort of deconstructed there. And my dream sort of took me back to that place 30 years ago. Oh. And I woke up, with a headache and a nausea. And
wow.
It wasn't an intellectual thing, but it was a bodily and a psychological thing. So I think I also talked a little about religious authorities and experts briefly in a comment that you made about the Pope and the Jesus scholars. And, Jennifer, you're a PhD and you're a teacher and you're a religious authority. And, I react somewhere in my history and somewhere in my gut to that religious authority with somewhat fear. And, I feel really grateful to be part of Trinity and to know a lot of you, and grateful to be part of a community of faith. And that's why I'm here. Really grateful for that.
I'm sorry to hear about the traumatic dream, but I suppose there was something important there to work out. I don't know. Yeah,
well, that's fine. I think that's the price of growth. And I realize that I'm not in my 20s anymore, and I have different tools to deal with. Right. And that's very good.
Mm-hmm. I said a couple of weeks ago, I continue to be curious about what resurrection means for Jesus. I sometimes say God doesn't go against God's natural laws. That being said, something happened 2,000 years ago to motivate, that's good enough for motivate people for 2,000 years to change lives and try to change other people's lives. And I'm guessing for all or most of us, that's very central to who we are. It was interesting. I had a conversation with a dear friend recently, and it came up, will we see one another in whatever it is to come? Well, I want to believe we will. I can't know that, but that's what I want to believe. So the whole concept of resurrection continues to to challenge me, to interest me. And I don't need to have definite answers about it. I just like to explore that.
Yeah, I did note that particular interest of yours, Harriet, at the beginning of this class, and I didn't circle back to it specifically.
That's okay.
Even to acknowledge it to you and to acknowledge that we probably weren't going to talk about it in this class, partly because it just isn't something that scholars are talking about. The issue of the resurrection is, you know, as obviously you all are aware, is that is central to, right, the Christian.
Right.
But that isn't central or even necessarily needing to be important in the conversation about the historical Jesus, because that is a set of beliefs, right? Which isn't what this particular scholarship is interested in. We could talk about how people do interpret the concept of the resurrection in ways that are sometimes profoundly helpful, and then in ways that redirect us from addressing the problems of the world. The concept of the resurrection, Jesus Christ as the first fruit, the resurrection of Christ from the dead, as the first fruits of the resurrection, when that directs our attention, or when our attention is directed toward heaven or heavenward, that does tend to distract us from attending to this world, right? But I am not going to say that there isn't something important in your deliberation, because I understand that they are quite important, right?
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. And they tell us something about where our minds and our hearts are, right? And I think that's almost as important as what we decide the answers to those questions might be, right? Being aware of what is important to us, what is maybe weighing on our minds, or what is various factors in our lives, right? For ourselves, for those who we love, in this time of pandemic with unprecedented number of deaths due to illness.
Jennifer, for me, I came to this sessions with no really expectations other than an interest.
Okay.
And, you know, having read and known Crossan and Borg a little bit.
Sure.
But for me, kind of last session, your quote from Heidegger that the history only exists out of a present resonated. And so through these whole 6 sessions, you know, a seed has been planted. And I'm always one to kind of let the question uproot the answer. So those seeds are within me, a lot of them. And now when I attend our church or hear homilies or read the Bible, it's always a little bit different. And so that's a good thing. I'm not sure what to make of it all yet, but yeah, so that's the gift for me anyway. So I'll sit with it for a while, probably a long time. So thank you.
Excellent. I'm quite pleased. Thank you, Detlef, for letting us know that. Any other thoughts before we launch into this, into some a little bit new content? Not perhaps not as much new as you might think, but perhaps we'll circle back, see if there are other comments or thoughts that you want to chime in. And in particular tonight, because I don't have a presentation specifically that I'm trying to direct our attention to, but I'm simply trying to raise a few points. Really, in a sense, kind of piggybacking on Detlef's observation that, you know, last week, Richard Truax said something about how some of these questions or conversations need to be raised for us over and over, or somebody, you know, sometimes we need to be reminded of different observations or things beyond the way we have thought of things. We kind of, like many parts of our lives, we don't take on a new perspective right away. We have to, you know, it has to confront us, or we have to be invited to consider it more than one time before it maybe makes sense, or before we connect with it, or whatever. So I think what I'd like to do is to share some tidbits from a few articles, actually. The one that did not make the cut for tonight, but I thought you all might appreciate the title, is The Fetish for a Subversive Jesus, by an up-and-coming scholar. He's a couple years younger than me in terms of in the field, and he lives in New Zealand, and he's just kind of hammering away at scholarship down there. It's really quite lovely. But his observations are about in this particular article, are about, what kinds of things do we want Jesus to be, and to what extent are people willing or interested in engaging, say, the political element of Jesus, and to what end? Even conservative biblical theologians such as N.T. Wright will say that Jesus is subversive without defining subversive. What do people mean? What are we trying to see? What are people getting from using this language? Is it just sexy, or is it meaningful? Anyway, so I think, and I reference this piece because I think it is akin to. Sorry about my cat. Cracks me up. It's in the same vein as some of the observations that these other articles are making as well. So, but the first piece that I wanted to, if you're interested, by the way, I can make these articles. These are all PDFs that I could make available to you. If you want to drop me an email, or I'm not sure the easiest way to convey these, if it's to send them to someone at Trinity and let them be bombarded. I'm happy to field emails because it doesn't take but a second to drop PDFs in an email. So if you'd like to ask me for them, that'd be fine with me. So my email is my full name, Jennifer Grace Bird, Jennifer with 2 N's, GRACEBIRD, and that's at Gmail. So if you're interested in any of these, I'm happy to share. Especially 2019, there's all 3 that I am sharing are from the Journal for the Study of Historical Jesus from the year 2019, which isn't widely available yet online. So I'd be happy to share those since the library went to the trouble to get it for me. Anyway, the first piece that I'm referring to is by Fernando Bermejo Rubio. And the article is Theses on the Nature of the Life of Jesus Research, the Lebens Jesu Forschung, a proposal for a paradigm shift in understanding the quest. And it sounded like precisely the kind of thing I was looking for this class. And so I thought, this is a perfect way to wrap up the class, right? So let me share a few of the theses. So I opened his article and I thought, okay, this is originally written in Spanish, was translated. I don't read Spanish. I appreciated the translation. Let's see what he's going to go on about. And when I first opened the article, it looked like there were 7 theses. When I started reading it, I realized there were 25. And really what he's doing is bringing together conversations that he's had with other scholars, kind of tracking the observations he's made of the historical Jesus research as a collective, and how it is talked about, how it is engaged, how it is referred to. Are there some understandings or beliefs about, for instance, this field of study, this historical Jesus research, that maybe need to be updated or that need to consider something new? And so I thought this is great. And I can tell you essentially the bottom line of his, I believe it was 25 theses. There may have been more actually. The bottom line of it is that he's essentially pointing out several of the things we've already noted in this class, which is that historical Jesus research is predominantly populated by people from a Christian background or who are identifying with the Christian framework of how to talk about Jesus. So that as the starting point actually leads to a bias that people potentially aren't even conscious of, and that needs to be addressed. And that is, I mean, of the 25, it's interesting the extent to which that and then teasing that out is central to what's going on here. The other primary interest of Bermejo Rubio is the idea that there were certain quests, that there was a quest that we can wrap up and talk about for, the first 35 years or whatever in the late 19th century, ending at the beginning of the 20th, and that there was a phase of no quest, as if there was a phase when scholars or pastors weren't actually thinking about the historical Jesus. And then there's a second quest that's not until after this, all these different quests, that this concept of here is one and here's one and here's one is a bit misleading, right? Because within any given quest, there are too many different trajectories or interests. It's not like there's something that unifies them all. They have different, there are different presentations, I suppose. And more importantly, I think, is that even within published serious historical Jesus scholarship, the scholarship starts long before Reimarus, which is where the first quest is said to have begun in the late 19th century. And so those are the two primary things. But let me read a couple of his theses just so you get an idea of what he has going on here. Jesus research arises from critically calling into question the reliability of the available resources and the portrayals of the Galilean preacher offered in them because of their unsatisfactory character from a historical and argumentative standpoint. So, historically speaking, what we know historically really doesn't jive with what we have canonically. And that deserves some observations and some deliberations. And that's precisely what, at each stage, even if we're going to refer to quests, which at the end of the article, he says, no serious scholar, it seems to him and many others, should continue to refer to quests anymore, because it's a fallacious representation of what has happened. And it's a representation that is significantly theologically driven, and therefore Christianly theologically driven, which is to say, not that Christian belief, there's anything wrong with it, with Christian theology and belief, but that, sorry, my cats are cracking me up tonight. The ways that biases what you're able to say is a bit limiting. So his second thesis, the history of Jesus research is swarming with odd phenomena, not to say, as I'm quoting him, hoary howlers, in a very high proportion. In other words, every field has these odd things going on, but the frequency of them within historical Jesus scholarship is striking, meaning, and so here's some of his examples. Despite the fact that Jesus was a full-fledged Jew, the notion that he somehow opposed Judaism has been overwhelming for centuries, and a somewhat de-Judaized Jesus is still offered as a credible figure. In other words, as we've noted in a couple of different points throughout these weeks, there is a recent wave of trying to re-Judaize Jesus, but it's not just that they've done it recently and finally, it's that it's happened time and time again over the past several centuries. I was actually I'm jumping ahead here in my notes. I was actually quite pleased to learn about a particular scholar, Leone Modena. I'm not sure which way to pronounce his name. I'm sorry. Leone Modena, I'm not sure, of the 17th century. So before any of the so-called quests even began, was thoroughly reading Jesus as a Jew, emphasized Jesus's embeddedness in Judaism, and remarked about his nearness to the Pharisaic sect in the doctrine and practice. Right? I mean, he's more Jew, he's entirely Jewish, and just, this scholarship in the late 1600s, right? Let me make sure in the mid to late 1600s is absolutely showing how Jesus was not Christian. Right. So it's not like it's just a modern thing that we're finally coming around to. It's that the Christian tradition that we have inherited has time and again seen fit to try to silence that Jewish part of Jesus. For me, as a non-historical Jesus scholar, but as a biblical scholar on a larger perspective, right? That's an important element for me and for us to understand of the history of the church, the history of the Christian tradition that has created and perpetuated an element, a strong seed of anti-Judaism, right? So it's not that, we should celebrate that scholars are finally taking Jesus's Jewishness seriously. It's that, why have we had so many cycles of this? I think that's a more interesting question. Or we could perhaps say, okay, so it's fine. We're coming back around to it. To what extent are we going to take that seriously? And I say that as someone who regularly hears people of all levels of ordination within Christian traditions unawarely perpetuating claims about first century Judaism that Jesus was interacting with in a negative way, right? The Judaism that of Jesus's day is repeatedly in sermons, in offhand comments, in casual remarks, mischaracterized negatively. And that is absolutely a result of this Christian exceptionalism, this idea that Jesus was unique in some way, which is actually shown to not be true, historically speaking. There's very little that is unique about Jesus, except that someone, Paul, came along and made a religion about him instead of focusing on the religion Jesus's religion, which is Judaism, and perhaps a particular prophetic element of it, but that's not unique, right? Prophetic in the genuine Hebrew Bible sense of prophets, right? I mean, the course, the 6 week, was that 6 weeks, Chris? I can't remember. 4 weeks, 6 weeks. I guess it was 6 weeks last spring. I had asked to do that class, and it was a meaningful one for me to do, but it was also very upsetting for me, because the more time I spend in Christian scriptures that enliven anti-Jewish sentiment, the more upsetting it is to me, because it's in there, and it's a part of beliefs that people have of the Christian tradition that go unquestioned. It's not the point of tonight, but I think that I think that this element of historical Jesus is not taken seriously enough. And the fact that it has had so many cycles, right, of squashing the Jewishness, trying to embrace it, and yet it doesn't fully take hold, and we go back to squashing it. And why does that happen? Anyway, okay, you all get the idea. I don't need to belabor this. Sorry. Okay, let me get back to my notes here. So that was the first one. Oh gosh, I got side. Okay, so I won't read them all, and I didn't even quote them all because there were too many of them. But another example of these odd claims, right? These odd claims that are not they're not peripheral claims. They're not things that come up in scholars who are just kind of considered out there. No, these are all things that you will find in scholarship of scholars who are central to these fields, who are considered highly educated people, and primarily they are white men. But in Germany, Jesus was depicted as an Aryan. That's, although Jesus' close disciples and co-workers probably well grasped his preaching, and any other view is counterintuitive. I mean, there was nothing complex about it, but we see, because of the Messianic secret and so forth, we see examples of the disciples being depicted as not getting it, right? And people believe that and pass it along, as compared to just, instead of understanding the propagandistic element of that, right? So I'm going to reread this. Although Jesus's close disciples and co-workers probably well grasped his preaching, and any other view is counterintuitive, right? Why would they be following if they didn't understand him? Why wouldn't he actually straighten them out and pull them aside and say, yeah, okay, you're not quite getting it, so I don't want you traveling with us, the band of folks here, unless you're on board with what we're doing, right? Here's what we stand for, right? It doesn't make sense. The contention that Jesus was misunderstood in key aspects is harbored by hosts of scholars, all kinds, both ends of the spectrum, ideologically, right? This is bizarre when you stop to think about it. And that was the thing too for me, was stopping to think about it. Some of the things he's pointed out in his 25 Theses, are like things that, not too long ago I was doing too, because I hadn't really stopped to think about what I was saying. Many exegetes and theologians strive to show that Jesus's message and deeds were liberating and more friendly to women's rights and status than the textual evidence allows for. That's a fairly common thing, especially in the last 40 years of feminist biblical scholarship coming to the fore. Because a lot of people want to champion Jesus, want to make Jesus their champion for whatever their cause, right? It's a really tricky thing in whatever space I might find myself in. And I'm referring to some social media contexts where I'm seeing these female pastors, talking about Jesus as this radical, badass feminist. I'm like, yeah, okay, not from that story though. Like the story you just referenced does not do that. And I'm really frustrated that you're twisting it to your ends instead of being honest about it, because he's actually being a bit of a jerk in that story. Anyway, that's all about the way we read, isn't it? Anyway, so forth and so on. Everywhere Jesus is portrayed as a convinced universalist, despite the evidence to the contrary, right? So forth and so on. So there are these elements of claims that are made about Jesus that even the Gospels themselves don't back up, much less historical contexts. Interesting. So I don't want to read through all of these theses, but this particular scholar, there are contrasting views of Jesus that show up over and over, meaning over the centuries, especially in terms of his Jewishness, which we've already touched on. Here's his point about the language and framing of the quests neither accurately reflects historical developments nor offers sufficient framing for how divergent the work in the research has been, so forth. So I think you get the idea. So what was interesting to me as I worked through this article was the lack of racial engagement or gender. And I think I got to the end of his article and I thought, well, he has trotted out at least 25 observations about this field of scholarship and how he and others think it ought to be essentially modernized. And I can't disagree with him, but it is also still going not far enough, in my opinion. And that is the rub in general when it comes to anything large. Any institution like the Catholic Church, as we were discussing last week. It's not like it's going to change overnight. Yeah. But when is it going to change? So it's like I had this frustration as I'm reading this article of, if such small steps are so difficult, So that's why I don't spend time doing historical Jesus research. It isn't meeting me. It isn't feeding the things I'm interested in feeding, in putting out into the world. And though I'm, this has been an interesting engagement for me, and I'm glad to know that it has had some fruit for you all. That's what's most important here. So there are scholars with, rooted in the historical Jesus field who would like to change it to, let's talk about trajectories. Let's talk about, instead of talking about quests, let's talk about the fact that there have been scholars for at least 4 centuries who've been trying to be honest about Jesus's Jewishness. Let's talk about that as a theme or an approach instead of talking about chronological endeavors. Let's talk about themes. And that way we actually pull in this historical context and respect really for the scholarship, for those who've come before us, and awareness of, there was pieces of this that I wasn't aware of, that, when we talk about publishing scholarship, the field of biblical studies proper is talked about as starting in the mid-19th century, which is interesting, right? Even that delineation has, I would suggest, a theological bias behind it, because we have scholars writing as early as the 2nd century, right? So what does that mean? Anyway, what counts as scholarship and what doesn't is interesting. We can refer offhandedly to those guys in the 3rd century, but we're not going to respect them. Well, I think we should respect them because we've been given their ideas and it's influenced what's come down the pipe to us. So anyway, so there's, small step forward in terms of where historical Jesus scholarship is, or where some people are hoping it is going. He refers in this project of his, in this summation, to this book, Jesus in an Age of Terror, Scholarly Projects for a New American Century, by the same scholar that whom I referenced the first week. I guess it was probably the second week, James Crossley, and Why Christianity Happened, and his particular engagement with economically disenfranchised, and how I suggested that his perspective on that is has a bit more heft than I've seen many other scholars engage in their scholarship on Jesus, perhaps because he can identify with that from his past more than most of the scholars who are writing about Jesus. I don't know that to be the case about all of them because I don't know their backgrounds, but when a person comes from a place of poverty, they identify with that in Jesus' stories. And you see that very clearly in Crossley's work. It comes back to the same issue, right, that Harriet raised, that we've kind of raised over and over. The depiction of Jesus that we see, that we create in our heads, reflects our own experiences and our own perspective on the world, for better or for worse, right? Anyway, in this book, which was published in 2008, I believe, so 2008, he's trying to essentially call out many of the things that Bermejo Rubio is pointing out 11 years later in an article, right? And to what extent is something like this actually taken seriously? He's not coming from a Christian background, so is he not respected for that reason? Is he too radical because he's talking too much about politics? This is a scary kind of an image. We don't want to engage that. That's not very friendly. It's not very lovely, right? It's pretty honest, though. And that's a reality that does connect to the gospel stories, or to the story of the life and the context of Jesus in the 1st century and who he was speaking for, right? The Age of Terror, well, that's a thing that Jesus most likely did know, right? As a Roman citizen, or under the Roman Empire, right? So I think okay. So let me keep going. Questions, comments, please. You were free to interrupt me and ask questions or make observations or whatever as we're going through this. I'm seeing mostly smiling faces. I'll keep going. There was an article in this same, I believe that the journal on the study for the historical Jesus, yeah, is, I believe it comes out 2 editions per year. So there are more than 300 pages of scholarship that are published. And so Richard Horsley's contribution is titled "Discerning What the Quest of the Historical Jesus Could Not See." And he is specifically engaging Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. Had any of you heard of this? Yes, 1, 2, several of you have heard of it. I hadn't read it. I wasn't familiar. I've heard people reference it, but I wasn't really familiar with it. So the second issue of this volume was specifically engaging Howard Thurman's work, Jesus and the Disinherited. The summary of what I found from Dick Horsley was that he did not engage the racial piece. Dick Horsley is a white man. And I like his work, you know, I do. I have quite a few of his books. I like that he's, you know, had an activist background and he brings those observations to his scholarship. But when it comes to gender and race, he leaves me a little flat, right? Because he's not engaging it. Lots of respect for Dick Horsley. So I'm going to quote from his article. He's talking about who Howard Thurman was and his contribution to the field. So he's talking about what Thurman is doing. So he's saying, along with many African-American intellectuals and leaders, Thurman was thinking of other peoples of color in Africa, India, and Asia who were living in similar situations under European colonial rule, referring to Jesus in the 1st century lived under Roman imperial rule or colonial rule, however you want to look at that. And that is what Horsley is saying Thurman's work is engaging that angle. Thurman's book, The Jesus and the Disinherited, is referred to as having given some framework or philosophy to the nonviolent resistant protests in this country because of his own interests primarily. And then he did go to India and did get to meet Mahatma Gandhi, but that was hand in hand with what he was already thinking, not just that he got this idea from Gandhi. I think that's important to note. But so that framework and that reading of Jesus as someone who was a nonviolent resistor of an imperial or oppressive rule. That's important. That's an important element of what he was talking about, right? Christianity, I'm back to quoting Horsley here. Christianity, having originated in a people subject to persecution and suffering, had become the cornerstone of a civilization and of nations that had wielded power over weak and defenseless peoples. So again, since I'm reading to you instead of having you able to see this, he's pointing out what Thurman is observing, right? That Christianity began with this guy, Jesus, who stood for the masses. And the masses at this point were subjects of Rome or the Roman Empire. So even though Christianity began in a people subject to persecution and suffering, Christianity itself, the religion of Jesus was for people suffering, right? The religion of Jesus was for those who were being persecuted and those who were suffering. The religion about Jesus then became a cornerstone of a civilization that wielded power over weak. It became possible for it to enable colonization. The religion of Jesus is for those being oppressed. The religion about Jesus enables those oppressors. this is the disconnect, the thing that people observe. My light just gave out. Sorry about that. The thing that people observe about Christian origins is this divide. Jesus was speaking for the oppressed, trying to hearten them, trying to find ways to survive oppression and suffering. And that's what his religion was useful for the masses, was enabling them to survive. The religion about Jesus then becomes depoliticized, becomes apolitical. It becomes about ideas, and it takes things into the heavenly realms, and that makes it useful able to be wielded by any power. So,
Jennifer.
Yes.
I just want to challenge that a little bit.
Okay.
And say that I grew up as a Baptist in Georgia, and in my lifetime, I've seen Martin Luther King Jr. prophet. I've seen John Lewis. I've been listening to Raphael Warnock preach this fall,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this isn't the first century, and this isn't a Christianity, of a colonial power, but it is on that trajectory that you were talking about of context, and it's a different context. Yes. And there are multiple contexts and multiple Christianities, and there's this idea of the authority, the expert, who one could project on the Pope or on a religious scholar, but as well as those who experience some other kind of power that Harriet has referred to, and that tell it out in ways that empower people and that shiver, by the Spirit.
So, not to put too fine a point on it, but what color was Martin Luther King Jr. and what colors was John Lewis, and what color is? We're talking about the issue, the reality of racism. Enables that is what is being brought to this conversation, right? The experiences of living as an African American, or the experiences of racism in this country, right, are what bring that. I mean, that is where they are connecting with the Jesus story. And the story of Jesus, the religion of Jesus, the story of his life it does connect, right?
Yeah, but it's not just those guys. It's people in Latin America. It's people in Africa.
Non-white, not colonizers, but those who have been oppressed by the colonizers.
But it's not just black, Jennifer. It's black and brown and white and yellow.
But that's my point. They are identifying with the religion of Jesus. White colonization has taken the religion about Jesus, the religion focused on Jesus, worshiping Jesus, versus those who've been oppressed, those who need to be lifted up, those who need to be released from suffering and oppression by their own country, oppression by their own governments, right? They identify with the life of Jesus, the religion of Jesus. The empires of the last 1700 years have taken up the worship of Jesus.
Well, that's where I don't follow your language. I think you're using the same language to say two different things.
Okay,
and I think you've got to get some, and that may be another trajectory. We need some better language.
Okay.
Because we're just, I don't think that gets us anywhere, but the wrong direction.
Okay, so let me see if I can clarify what I mean by what I'm saying. When I talk about the religion of Jesus, I mean Jesus's religion. Jesus, Jesus's religion.
His
What
belief
he-
system as a Jew,
Yeah.
Jesus' religion, Jesus, the historical person's belief system, his way of living, his diet, his practice.
His voice for the oppressed, or his voice for the voiceless.
And that certainly transcends that one man, you know, and that is within the Hebrew tradition, and that's within the various Christian traditions, and it's also within other traditions.
Yes, yes, but predominantly Western Christianity has focused on the worship of Jesus, not the practices that got him killed, but focusing on worshiping the guy, worshiping the God, Jesus. These are two different ways. These are two different perspectives, are they not?
Well, you know, I think there are many, many more than two, and that's what I'm saying. If you group Western Christianity together or Christianity together, I think it's you know, a big generalization. And I think, you know, I come from a Protestant tradition, and you came from Methodist, and they are very much the same, but they are reformers. And there's an Anglican tradition and an Episcopal tradition, and they are from England. And there are all of these different Christianities. I get it that you don't like oppression and colonialism and Christianity and capitalism, and I don't either. But I don't feel like to, you know, just say that is the Western church. I feel like that is misleading and simplistic. And to open it up and to look at things in context a little bit more has helped me.
I feel like we might be missing each other or misunderstanding each other. So I'm going to reread the quote from Horsley. Christianity, having originated in a people subject to persecution and suffering, Christianity had become the cornerstone of a civilization and of nations that had wielded power over weak and defenseless peoples. So all I'm trying to highlight in quoting this is a generalization that can be observed in a fundamental different starting point.
But Jennifer, I get what you're saying. This is the danger when, you know, marginal movements or people working at the margins for justice, equality against an empire becomes the empire, becomes mainstream, right? And so in Canada, the doctrine of discovery, and around the world, when people traveled around the world who were Europeans, settled countries, that was theirs, irregardless of the people who lived there before, right? So that would have been anathema. So it's much like the Roman emperor multiplied all over the world. And so now we come to this place where we say, yeah, that's not correct. And now how do we deal with that, right? In our country, it's around the indigenous stuff fundamentally. And I think in your country, the same. So, I mean, yeah, I get it, right? In the name of religion, and Western religion, predominantly Roman Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, in Canada, lots of stuff happened that was not in the Jesus lifestyle, right? It was in the form of an oppressive kind of thing. Right or wrongly, they didn't view it as that, but it was in that way. So it's absolutely true.
I appreciate that, but I'm also trying to, you know, I feel like there are many things to say, maybe to clarify what I'm trying to get at, Chris, and I don't know if it all needs to be addressed, but we could even just start with, for instance, the creeds. The creeds define Christian belief, and the creeds are about belief. They're not about.
They define here. All I'm saying is they define a Christian belief.
Sure. Yeah.
And there are many creeds and there are many different Christian beliefs.
Well,
You know, and that's
primary creed that all Christians, in order to claim to be Christian, are supposed to agree to. I mean, that's, you go down the Nicene Creed, that is what it means by definition on the planet.
yeah, but you know what it meant to me to grow up as a Baptist was we don't believe in creeds. You know, we are a non-creedal person, and so all I'm saying is this Christian life breaks all of those boundaries. It breaks all of those categories. It breaks all of those structures. Just like any image of God is great, but it's only an image of God, and God is beyond any image. And
Right.
so that's sort of fundamental to the spiritual quest. I also, you know, just want to say I feel like I can't be a Christian if that's what Christianity is.
Fair enough. And that is why there are scholars making claims such as, you know, Spong saying why Christianity needs to change or die. It needs to change. Yes. And I think that most people on this Zoom call, this Zoom class, are in agreement with that, right? As are you, it sounds like, very vehemently, right? What I'm trying to talk about is what we see in scholarship and what we hear scholars saying, and what unfortunately is predominantly taught in seminaries, not solely, but the seminary I went to, I was not encouraged to learn liberation theology. I got that because I chose to take a class on it and it was considered heretical. That was Princeton Theological Seminary.
Wow.
Right? I wrote a book called Permission Granted, Take the Bible into Your Own Hands, because I wanted to find a way to make these really obvious things that we all learned in seminary accessible to people in the pews, because way too many preachers were leaving seminary and were leaving most of that learning behind because it was too foreign. It was too much of a push for people back in the pews. And I feel like we need to bridge that, or we're going to keep this cycle going. So I'm trying to talk about what is happening in scholarship, okay? And when the traditional scholarship focuses on the religion worshiping Jesus, and that's the focus, as compared to yes, as you appropriately point out, the many ways around the globe that Christianity looks like the siding with the poor, right? God is the God of the oppressed. God sides with the poor. God wants to, you know, however you want to look at that, however you want to define those different movements, those different variations of Christianity around the world. So here's the thing. I mean, okay, so I'm not trying, okay, so there is the traditional voice, the mainstream voice within historical Jesus studies is the voice that focuses on the religion about Jesus, not Jesus's religion as a Jew. And so it is not widely embraced. It is a difficult thing to get scholars to even acknowledge that there is a difference, to even acknowledge that the things that got Jesus killed are not a part of the worship of Jesus. Okay? That distinction is not something that all Newer Testament scholars even acknowledge, right? So if we have the people who are writing the scholarship out there is not even acknowledging these things, right? I mean, no wonder you, Chris, had this overwhelming traumatic dream, right? Your own realities coming up again, and you went to seminary, right? Coming up against what you've been, I mean, there's all kinds of layers going on there for you. Okay, so talking about Jesus scholarship, I'm moving on to a third article, not because I'm trying to ignore your pushback. I agree with your pushback. This class is trying to talk about the scholarship.
I didn't feel ignored at all. Thank you.
Okay. But I'm quoting now from a third piece in the same year, 2019's issue volume from the Journal for the Study of Historical Jesus. And this is by Mitzi J Smith. And I referenced her last week briefly, not that I expect you all to remember all these things. But she is quite prolific. And I've actually suggested I do a course on for you all on her scholarship, because it is all so dramatically important, in my opinion. She is a womanist Newer Testament scholar, and I love her work. So she states that the religion about Jesus has failed the oppressed. The religion about Jesus, the worship of him, has failed the oppressed. And that is why books such as Jesus and the Disinherited are needed, because it does bring you to the point of saying, oh, no. Let's look at the ways people over the centuries, but always the masses or those who've been voiceless, power, or perceived to be powerless, etc. They absolutely connect with the Jesus story. It is still relevant. It does, okay. So when Thurman writes a book, Jesus and the Disinherited, it wasn't embraced. It wasn't seen as obvious. It wasn't seen as XYZ in this country. And so I'm quoting Smith here, saying, during Thurman's lifetime, excuse me, I just need to pause for just a second. This is driving me. During Thurman's lifetime, the conventional voice of Christianity was muted, perplexed, elusive, and more concerned with its own security and respectability, siding with the strong over against the weak. As another Newer Testament scholar, Aubrey Hendricks, asserts, this is likely an understatement. So he's saying, undoubtedly, the acceptance of the unchristian ethics of political oppression, social domination, elitist privilege, and concretized hierarchy into the faith of the theology of the church has essentially perverted Jesus's message so as to contradict that which he lived and died for, and would surely oppose if he physically lived among us today, right? So these observations needed to be made by Thurman in the mid-20th century. Scholars are still making it at the beginning of the 21st century. It's still not fully embraced. It's not something that everybody agrees to. So, I sit here saying, well, what's it going to take? What's it going to take for people to take this part seriously? For my colleague, Mitzi Smith, engages Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider, Dolores Williams, who's a Hebrew Bible scholar. She engages her book, Sisters in the Wilderness, which reads the Hagar narratives in Genesis from the perspective of Black women's history of surrogacy. All that being forced to focus on the children of white women to the neglect of their own. And she also engages Angela Sims' book, Lynched, which provides insights from Black survivors who remember lynching or domestic terrorism, which weaponized fear as a means of controlling Black people. I'm quoting Smith here. Sims discusses the survival strategies that Black folks used within a culture of fear that white people created. So Thurman's interpretation of Jesus and the religion of Jesus, his religion, is the first African interpretation of Jesus within his social historical context from the perspective of the disinherited. That isn't to say that no other Black person made those observations, but it's the first time it was vocalized and contextualized, that keeping the issue not just of class, but of race in mind and bringing it to the fore. There are so many things that, as I'm reading through Smith's article, for instance, that I think are relevant, and I don't know when this kind of thinking will be normative within Newer Testament scholarship in general, much less specifically historical Jesus, because the historical Jesus scholarship is predominated by white men, predominantly not those who are activists, not those who are actively, radically addressing the systemic racism or the effects of sexism. And choose your institution. So she notes, for instance, Thurman was reared by his mother and his grandmother. His grandmother was enslaved for the first 20 years of her life. And Thurman grew up on the Jim and Jane Crow of the South. She comments on all the issues that you all, I'm sure, are familiar with, the issues, the economic ways, the educational deficits that were, systematized. The enslavement of Black bodies has been replaced with the buildup of America's prison nation, to which Black people are sentenced more often for minor crimes and receive longer prison sentences for nonviolent and violent crimes. I'm sure you're all well aware of this, and I'm guessing that many of you have read The New Jim Crow, right? So the question then, what does Jesus have to say to disinherited Black people today? So she goes on to talk about how Thurman, and then she brings in Borg's work as well, that Thurman and Borg both acknowledge, right? They acknowledge that Jesus was poor, was of a social reality, of being among the masses of dispossessed, poor people. Borg also endorses this, Jesus's Jewishness, as well as his low status class-wise, right? But it's interesting, Borg doesn't mention Thurman's book. And I have to admit, I don't have Marcus's book, this particular one, Jesus Uncovering the Life, Teachings, and Relevance of a Religious Revolutionary. I don't have it, and I have not read it. So I don't know if he does actually have Thurman's book listed in the works cited, for instance. But it does make my heart race a little bit to say this, right? Because it was just 30 years prior to Borg's work, and it doesn't seem to be treated. So this raises a really interesting question. They both identify the mystical side of Jesus. Borg addresses class, but not race. Thurman engages both due to his reality, but neither Thurman nor Borg directly address sexism. It's worth noting. They both talk about this issue of citizenship and the rights that denies people. But what I see in Smith's engagement, for instance, she makes comments such as this: I surmise that the historical Jesus was conscious of the oppression that poor colonized women endured, since he had a poor colonized mother and two unnamed sisters. In this country, the United States, enslaved African women endured hard, unrelenting labor, sexual assault, and rape by enslavers and some enslaved African men, who themselves also had experiences of sexual assault. But enslaved Black women were forced to prioritize the nursing, feeding, and care of white babies to the neglect of their own, who received the crumbs from the master's table, which is a really delightful reference to one of the stories about Jesus and his interaction with a woman, the Syrophoenician woman. One of the reasons I like this reference is it gets at the economic issue behind that particular story that I rarely hear scholars, much less pastors, engage, right? This woman comes to Jesus and says, he asks him to heal her daughter. And he's like, and he refers to her as a dog. Is that him challenging her to see if she'll rise to the occasion? Is he just being a jerk? More likely he's just being a jerk, and he doesn't realize, by looking at her, he doesn't realize who she is socially or economically, that she is also being exploited by what that city and its materialism is doing to the surrounding area, much less to Jesus' own context. So if he's coming to this city saying, these people have been oppressing us, And then she comes and asks for help. He's like, no, you're part of the people who are oppressing me over back here in Galilee, in my hometown. She's like, no, I'm in the surrounding area. I'm also being exploited by this town. You know, it shifts the whole thing. Instead of it being about belief in her faith, it's actually about economics, you know, and you need someone who's willing to see that. In the religion of Jesus, God resides in and with the oppressed within a culture of fear. Williams argues that the Hagar in the wilderness symbolism is Hagar's and Black women's and Black people's encounter with a threat of death-dealing circumstances. I mean, oppressive power structures and peoples in the US have utilized threats of death and destruction to control the movements, behaviors, and mobility of the Black community. Hagar's wilderness experience symbolizes this. I mean, it's taking all of these biblical references to just a meatier, more important, more hefty, in my opinion, you know, level of serious and taking it much more seriously. And I feel like I just am saying the same things over and over, that pale male scholarship written by white men has been lacking on the race element, and has been significantly lacking in terms of issues of sexism or misogyny or patriarchal entitlement or whatever you want to say. In fact, that's an argument I've had with Bart Ehrman by email for the last year. I've suggested more than once in person 11 years ago, and then by email, that I don't think I wish he were more feminist. He took offense at that. I understand why, but it's when a scholar doesn't even understand why that's even a conversation to have. You know, he doesn't even see our differences. That's another conversation. But my point is, it's a whole nother level. It's just a whole nother level that bringing in race and sex or gender, it brings to the whole conversation that's up to this point is missing. So who knows to what extent it will be embraced or taken seriously within scholarship. Comments, questions?
My takeaway from Marcus Borg was that the most important thing was to follow the way that Jesus, in his life, he challenged the status quo. He sought to make quantitative changes, but what really got him killed was his desire and his attempts to make qualitative changes, and he paid for it with his life. So he was always about challenging the authorities, the religious authorities and the authorities of the empire. And Jesus didn't come to start a new religion. He was a Jew. And I just read something in the New Yorker comparing, it was the personal Bible of, Thomas Jefferson's personal Bible of Jesus or whatever. But he made this comparison that Jesus was to Judaism as Martin Luther was to the Reformation, which I thought was kind of interesting. But over and over again, Marcus Borg always is talking about the way. That's what we do. We follow the way. And it's not about beliefs. I mean, you know, when we talk about religion, we're submitting ourselves to the dogma or the teachings or what white privileged men identify as what you need to believe in order to get to heaven. But Jesus was not about heaven. He was about the kingdom of God on earth. I remember Marcus Borg saying, he was criticizing the punctuation that's exhibited with the Lord's Prayer, where we break up, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And it should all be together, what Marcus said. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, because Marcus said, heaven's fine. It was earth what God is worried about. You know, I think, you know, Jesus did have some understanding and some relationship to the women's question, because he spoke to women addressed women, taught them, had them sit, interacted with them at a time when women's testimony was never accepted in a court of law. So he did elevate women, had to recognize it.
He did, but I do want to comment that he wasn't unique that way.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying that just to say that Jesus didn't.
People want to make him a super feminist, and
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying he didn't necessarily ignore it totally.
right, sure.
Yeah, right. And what about the story of the Good Samaritan? Is there any race involved with that, or is it just class divisions?
Well, I think that is about race. I do think that is about othering. Right?
Yeah. The class, different divides. Yeah. But that's just always is ringing through to me, is that it's challenging the religious and the imperial authorities, and that Jesus was there to feed the hungry, and he was on the side of the poor, and and I was really moved by back in the 60s and 70s with liberation theology too, and that's what Jesus was about, being on the side of the poor, but not just being on the side, but actually trying to make systemic changes, not just quantitative ones, but systemic changes. That's what it was all about. But you have to do a number of quantitative changes before you can have qualitative changes, and change is constant. I understand what you're saying, but there's no such thing as one true religion, which, as much as we'd like to think that we're on the right track in some ways, but I think all religions are dealing with the human condition. I was raised as a fundamentalist, and it was sort of like just the religion of fear, not, if you don't believe the right thing, you're not going to get to heaven. And it's Marcus that pointed out, how infantile that is. It's focused on being born again instead of growing up.
I'm glad he pointed that out for you all. It isn't that he's the first to have pointed it out.
I know. It's just that I've been so ignorant of everybody else. Yeah, so that's why I really welcome hearing about the other theologians who have addressed how they've addressed these issues.
Can I just, I have a question, a clarification question, when you were talking about the change over time from the religion of Jesus to religion about Jesus. So did I understand you correctly that for the most part, the study of the historical Jesus focuses pretty much on that one part of being the religion about Jesus, and pretty much ignores the religion of Jesus? The field of study itself, the scholars that study it are focusing on just the one question and not so much of the other one?
Yes, and it's bigger than that. So yes, the central figures in historical Jesus research predominantly have that as in their background, right? As we're looking to define this guy who lived historically, that this lens of the Christian tradition overshadows or is unacknowledgedly tainting, skewing even, offering a bias on how people are interpreting the evidence. But it is absolutely crucial to me to at least entertain the idea that the guy who lived, right, whatever he did that got him killed, that's all very relevant throughout the ages. But what Paul did in creating this other sect of Judaism that became Christianity, what Paul did in that first century was to direct us to a religion about Jesus.
Mhm.
So it's there at the beginning.
Mm.
And as Chris has pointed out, that has been the norm to varying degrees throughout history, right? Various movements and religious groups have taken it to the people. It's about, right? It's about fixing this world. But the church, in terms of people wanting to define orthodoxy, people wanting to say what is correct and what is being declared heretical, like that starts in the 4th century, right? We're making those very, or before that, but we're making very clear, right? Conciliar claims about correct belief and et cetera, et cetera. So I think when you look at the Pauline letters, you see the seeds of what becomes the religion about Jesus, the worship of Jesus, not living the way, not living.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I find this study of Paul and the claims made about Paul, and I find it really much more complicated than it's complicated. You know, there's a scholar at Vanderbilt who was highlighted this past week because he wrote a modern letter that Paul might have written, and that got the attention of some news outlet. I don't know if it was NPR, but anyway, I just, you know, we're still doing it. We're still taking Paul as a champion and what he did as a good thing and as a model for us, even though, you know, Thurman, along with others, you know, are willing to say there's some really negative models there for us in Paul's letters, in Paul's rhetoric, and what Paul's claims lead to, et cetera, you know. It's all there. It's all there in the origins, it's all there in script, in the canon. And everybody has a canon within the canon. It's just that simple, right? What we do value, what we do not find to be inspired by God, even though the claim is, you know, however you want to handle the word of God as it gives forth life, right? That is what makes it the word of God, if it gives life. We all have our own ways of handling that, I think. It is 8:30 and a few minutes, so I feel like I need to wrap this up. I appreciate your attention.